therefore it should be just the limit of certain thing. Now, one very interesting, let's say, example of that is a human being. We have a foot, we have a hand. Actually, so if you say our function of a hand to let's say walk, hold something, or climb something, or carry something, or feed ourselves, or write, or something, then we shouldn't be doing this, because we can say there's no function of this, or we shouldn't be clapping. Same thing with the foot. We should be just using for sitting down, standing up, and never dance, in fact. So that's the kind of emotional factor the Wooden School sort of left it out in a way, to some extent. And some of them took it to a level of so much understanding of rigorous function that the almost, one could say, the poetics, the meaning is sort of lost. On the other hand, all the cultures around the world, they have innately certain, because as a human being, certain kind of meanings, associations, and so forth. I mean, these somehow got left over in industrial design in a big way. And these qualities, what I call them as sensorial qualities, are somehow lost somehow in a taking over to the industrial product. So let's say if we take an example of Apple computers, which are very articulately made, very well designed, everything sort of works seamlessly to great extent, not always, we know that, and it's always given as a great design example around the world, and which I agree. But this is what I have to say about it, that is one way of doing thing, actually. That is a one process, one idea of doing thing. If one expect an entire planet to just do that path of design, I think that will be a sad world, actually, because if you understand design as a human expression, we have very many different possibilities of expressions, possibilities of saying something. And that's where I understand form as a language. A language has a history, language has a deep continuity, and a language also evolves every single time. So form as a language makes more sense to me rather than talking entity in just the physical sense, because everything has a form, really. I mean, if you really think about it, almost everything has a form. Even your thought has a form. You see violence in a society has a form. You see some kind of a novel or a literature, it has a form. And of course, we are talking in a very primal sense, form in a sense of a physical object, because we make a physical object, but software also has a form. And software also evokes certain way of thinking in a person who uses it. And that also has a form, And many of the software, I could say with any hesitation, is that they don't necessarily have a great form, because the seamless way one could use, and what comes to my mind is the kind of 3D CAD we use now. I mean, there are many, many issues where one could think very quickly that they could have been better, but they are not better, And that is also lack of thinking, the understanding of this system as a form itself, So there are all these things, actually. So where can I start? I mean, there is all this continuity happen, and then historic sense, actually, I would say. So there is this notion was there, like form follows function, which is extremely limiting in some sense, because in my view, one cannot divorce them, They are so much integral part of the project that you can't separate this than the other, because everything, all the consideration one has on a project, they kind of influence each other. And when they influence each other, the outcome is a result of that. So it's not just you have a form and that's it, and these are separate and you're putting them together. That was maybe the beginning of the design profession, when they made some technological gadget, whatever, and then somebody covered the thing on it and then gave us some kind of form or decoration. To an extent that here, I'm sitting now in Netherlands, that the designer in a traditional sense is called a form giver. Literally means somebody who gives form, And that meaning is extremely limiting. Now, limiting in a sense, it literally means you're not the one who has intellectual idea, you're not the one who have a cultural contribution in a discourse of a making of a culture. It has all these implied meaning, actually. But so a lot of people actually rejected that term in a sense that you're not just the form giver, like just the maker of something pretty, The American, there's a beautiful term called for that. They say putting a lipstick on a pig, because somebody made an ugly machine, you have to try to make a make something beautiful out of it. So all these notions are there, and I think these are because these are the limitation, because they are understood in industrial evolution actually, that the designer comes uh, almost towards the end when you have to just finish it off the project, you know. Now already when let's say 20 years ago, for sure this kind of thing sort of changed quite drastically. The designers became part of the management. Designers were part of the R&D at the very primary level. I've been working like that as well with the corporations, where you conceive the idea together. So it is not that you're a part of the chain at the end to make something beautiful, but you are a strategic thinker in a sense that you take decisions and responsibility along the way, and you bring in design considerations right in the beginning actually, you know. And that makes a possibility of creating something which is more meaningful in a different manner than otherwise you conceive something technically sort of works, but it's either not human, it doesn't work properly with the people, it's not intuitive, all those issues were there. That does not mean the battle is won. I mean, still, majority of the world, there are almost no exceptions. Even today in 2020, most of the corporations, designers are not sitting on the board, actually. There are very, very few of them. At the same time, the design is still not taken to the level. It is always considered as something to make something beautiful, almost in every culture. Design literally considered as something, you make something beautiful, that's all, you know. Design is a strategic tool in a very, very core sense, and it has a lot to contribute in any culture, and it's definitely in industrial culture, actually, you know. So what can I say? So one could say the reaction of the people towards the form was, hey, form is, form giving is like just the superficial. In America, that was called styling. Now, this kind of a thinking, people reacted, and they kind of reacted that the form is, some people reacted in a way that the form is not important. What does that mean is, hey, it's not something, just make something out of it, or just make rational, straightforward stuff, and that's it, you know. Now, and I disagree with that position, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to create a kind of a sensorial connection, some kind of meaningful connection with the audience. And what I mean by audience is a user here. In a very meaningful way, and one could contribute in a culture of making in a very in a systematic way, that it has a meaning and it can connect with the past. Now, on one hand, modernity gave us many things actually, you know, and that modernity within Indian context has many problems, and we should know that. And if we don't know that, we will make blunders like we couldn't imagine. But if you look at modernity gave a lot of things, but there's also one aspect which is lost, is to understand the past and not to copy the past as a tradition as it is, but to question the past actually. But at the same time, understand what makes sense and reject totally what doesn't make sense, you know. And if this kind of let's say, cultural confidence we do not develop, it will go nowhere, because it will either the imitation, then the rhetoric of so-called Indian design sounds extremely poor and laughable from seen from international perspective. And I think this kind of a discourse actually, because calling something this design or that design, it doesn't make sense, because the moment if something has a genuine human content, it will be appreciated. And you see that in a literature, you see that in a music, you see that in all sorts of forms of expressions. And design as yet is not there, you know, in that sense of expression. And that has been my personal journey actually, to ask those primary questions and try to find expression that has its own roots, but also has some kind of a connection and has a contemporary nature to it. It is not something just, let's say, either imitation of something, so, or repetition, or just creating crazy, whatever so-called futuristic stuff, you know. So in this context of understanding of or talking about a form, one thing comes to my mind is, I think making form is almost, I call it inventing form. I like, now let's not make mistake here that I don't mean to say that I don't understand the difference between invention and innovation. Of course, there's a clear difference, and I hope you all understand the difference between invention and innovation. But I would dare to say that the form is an invention, because that is what creates our cultural totems, our cultural references, and that's how you propel in a human society actually. So in that sense, form is definitely invention. Now, in that sense of having a courage to do that, to be able to express something that has been never expressed that way, or create a continuity where it's necessary. And I will try to show some of those projects where some of these things have been taken, because in some cases there's no reference, you do something totally new. And if you think like that, every single object we use at one point in time in history was made totally new, actually. And since it has used for all these years and it became part of our collective memory, we accept it and we call sometimes tradition, we call sometimes part of the heritage, history, whatever. And so the question, all of these things, I think is a very, very primary need. And here comes another thing, which became a provocation, and probably many of you are aware about. The co-founder of Apple Computers, Steve Wozniak, said something in press in India because he came to give keynote addresses in some corporations in Bangalore, and he was criticizing that within India there is no creativity and it's not nourished and people are not doing enough, and it was misinterpreted, and all kind of chauvinism and thing came into picture of discussion. But there was a very critical and important, let's say, remark from somebody who has spent all his life and still continue to do on really exploring the unknown actually, and understanding that as well, with no arrogance, but genuinely trying to do something new. And I think what we really see there is the ability to do something, ask primary question, and take a step on that. And design, in my view, is at the crossroads of those. And I think it has a lot to contribute to be able to do that. It's not, I never understood design as just the possibility to serve the corporation. I think that's a very limiting understanding actually, and design in a true sense is a culture making activity, and within that, a part of manufacturing and part of the commercial world is one aspect of it, but is not the whole actually. And I think that needs to be understood in a very, very primary way. And design, when I say design, I literally mean in a very plural way. Design literally means it could be a piece of software, it could be a piece of animation, it could be object, it could be, I don't know, a complex system, it could be an airport check-in system. It is all of it I'm calling up to the built environment, like infrastructure, up to the level of urbanism, So it is not, in a reductive sense, just one thing. One could talk only objects right now because we can simplify our conversation, but in design, to me, in that sense, is all of that, So it's a system of thinking, it's a system of understanding, all of it actually. And there is a beautiful definition Sotsas gave. He said even talking about design is also design. You see what I mean? So this is a very interesting thing to understand, and it has to be understood primarily as a cultural act. It is not a technical act. It is often misunderstood as a technical act. Of course, not to, let's say, downgrade or consider technicality as less. I mean, that's a very primary knowledge, material knowledge, knowledge of manufacturing, knowledge of ergonomics. All of those are the primary, let's say, ingredients of a design, but that does not mean it's that, So all of it has to be understood as a cultural act, actually, within a broader sense of, let's say, in terms of human making in a sense of we make everything, we make software, we make culture actually, Culture does not happen on its own. We do create it and we continue it, So this is a very, very important thing in my understanding of design, as well as within that sense of form. Now, talking about form, there is one discovery I made many years ago, and that discovery was to understand certain forms, because there's a certain language in each culture, and each culture has a different way of interpretation. So if you, let's say, go to Korea, South Korea, let's say, which is accessible, not the North, you see certain language, certain understanding of a form, certain let's say, sense of proportion, sense of making things. If you say the country like Japan, there is certain sensibility in that, because Japan has a more exclusivity because it's an island and historically it's been secluded for a long time. you see that if you go to Finland, you see certain sensibility, uh, and that sensibility, I wanted to understand what are the kind of a deep-rooted making of a form within the Indian context, actually, and to understand is to understand how things are made in a primary sense. And I don't mean by primary sense means 10, 20, 30 or 100 years ago. I want to know really the beginning of beginning, And I could not find more information by very accident, just out of my curiosity, in a library which is not so far from our studio actually is a tropical museum. It's a very ancient historic building, and under the ground they have like a temperature control library. And I found something there, a small article by Philip Rawson. And Philip Rawson was one of the spent a lot of time in India. And he talks the method of sculpting in India, which was the first time I found something creating a kind of a convex forms and so forth, and understanding of sculpting and making a form. Now, we don't have those examples from thousands of years. The only surviving examples we have are the architecture, the rock cut architecture, and the sculptures, And then I get to travel and see those sculptures and rock cut architecture. There he calls very interestingly that if you take the sculpting, which you see it in, let's say, coming from the Greek tradition, and then that becomes the Roman tradition, that becomes so-called Western. And I do not subscribe to these terms. These are the terms used for we need to redefine the world in a better way. But that's another conversation. But for this, let's say, our own, this conversation, if I say one tradition of sculpting where, let's say almost the mathematics has been used, the proportion of a human body is exactly as it is. So if you go to Italy, you go to Rome, you go to Florence, you see all those sculptures, and the rest of the Europe, you see these sculptures, which is coming from, let's say, the Greek tradition. Let's put it this way, if you want to put the name on it. And that's a very mathematical, let's say, anatomy of a human body, actually, represented almost, let's say, very precisely as it is, to an extent that there was a sculptor called Canova in Italy, and there's a beautiful museum close to Venice where all the plaster of Paris models are somehow stored. And there's a beautiful, very tiny museum designed by Carlo Scarpa, close to Venice, where you see how the method was translated. That is called Canova method. Like 3 points in a space are translated from a plaster model to a stone, means a marble model, because marble, once you make a mistake, you can't go back. Plaster, you can go back, So how to translate this? It's literally, one could say, the early 3D scanner, We have now a 3D scanner and we can build them the shape we want to. It's exactly that you're doing with the manual, this kind of thing. But there's a precise anatomical translation, one-to-one, from let's say the model to translate into, the human proportion translate into making a sculpture. That is one school of sculpting, one could say. And if you look at all the ancient Indian sculptures, and you have to go back really a couple of centuries before the Common Era, you see the sculptures which survive now, actually. The earliest one, you could say, just you go date back. And some of them are the archaeological, let's say, sites which are unfortunately in our country not kept very well and not easy to access, not easy to go. But if you go there, there are also some on the Bombay-Pune road as well, And you find a very different sculpture, and that's what Philip Rawson calls it, a poetic analogy of a form, where the human body is not represented in a technical way, mathematical way, as 1:1 idealized form of a human proportion, but it has a poetic analogy that it suggests something. It is not translated into, and let's make no mistake here, that one could say, and this kind of conversation comes, and that comes because either there's a lack of global understanding, or either there is a agenda of the colonial thinking, which is always showing who is better than the other. Let's put that all aside, because that doesn't interest us, and we are far beyond that time. The interesting thing in a poetic analogy, as Philip Rawson very beautifully articulates, is the suggestion of something. It is not a representation. It's to suggest something, And it to suggest something means it's a poetic notion that you evoke your emotion towards something. So it's not something very, let's say, technical or mathematical. It's really very poetic. It's very narrative in that sense. And that kind of a poetic analogy, and when I was doing the early work, and when I did the early work, like one of the important thing after doing a lot of technology work is I really discovered this lost wax casting process, which was a process by which one could create this specific sensoriality, because I was very keen to understand how one could create a human sensorial feeling. Because in an industrial product, let's say in all the injection molded products or plastic products, you lost this sense of touch, like what we used to have in a very natural way. So instead of making something, let's say, so-called nostalgia, no, this none of nostalgia, is how can one could bring those qualities into contemporary product. That was the concern. And with that concern, I discovered this process and I made certain thing. Now, those were kind of discoveries, personal discoveries, and that created a kind of, when they were shown in Milan, that created a kind of polarity. And polarity with important people, I mean, critics, museum directors, curators, and people from academics and industry as well. I mean, they always created a kind of two camps. Some people sort of understood it at the intuitive level at least, and some people sort of rejected it. And of course, myself within that, I cannot say at that point I understood the whole conversation. I'm very clear about this, but I always wanted to know more and understand more, that, hey, what is going on here? Some people were like, hey, here is something totally new. And important people who have a very big, important track record and work and behind them, and their opinion counts. And people didn't understand, they rejected it, something very strange actually. But when I found Philip Rawson's this article about, he talks about method of Indian sculpting, and there he explains a poetic analogy, I understood that, hey, it's something going on. So I'd gone deeper into it and understood that, hey, this is the direction I'm exploring actually intuitively. And where we're going is in that direction of exploring that poetics actually. And that's where the lot of series of projects early on happen, is that to create that expression, create that understanding, create that language, and express that language not only just as a standalone prototype or an object, but can we translate also in extremely tough industrial projects where the technology is very important, manufacturing is important, therefore the cost is very important, because you cannot just do whatever and it can cost whatever, so one can't afford the industrial product. So how can one take that journey from object, conceiving this for this way of understanding form as a poetic analogy, and taking it to really industrial design in a capital world, which has a lot of let's say, one could say constraint challenges, because the thing has to be produced at certain cost. The thing has to be made with certain component. You can't make a certain thing. I'm talking the glass table in this context, which pushes many limits actually. So design in that sense is the synthesis of so many parameters that one can't really isolate one from the other, because if one doesn't work, the object will be meaningless in that sense. If the extensible table doesn't work, doesn't function in a sense, it will be meaningless, It's a useless object in a way, So this understanding is a very innate, and it's a continuous synthesis, And in that sense of understanding, let's say, a form, the question of, when you talk about industrial production, another very question which is, let's say, almost on the minds of everybody around the world, because we have gone through such a hyper consumption, and we also got that disease in India as well right now, that the consumption gets geared up so much that it creates a lot of trash. And the sustainable design is another norm, and I was invited to head the master program, all of those things. In that case, I would say even one step further, one could create a very sustainable product, which has correct sourcing of material, doesn't pollute, does the thing properly, works, and so on and so forth. You do all the things right, but if it doesn't connect with the end user, what's the use of it? They might trash it, they might not like it, all those kind of things. So I would say the true sustainable design is the design where the user refuses to throw away the product. That will be the true sustainable design. You know, you do all the things right, you manufacture in the right way, you source the material right way, it works, it does what it's supposed to do. That's all clear. That doesn't get compromised. But the real sustainable design will be the one which really somebody refused to throw, because it becomes a part of generation, goes to. These are the thoughts that have been on back of my mind while creating, let's say, the 100-year celebration piece for Poltrona, you know, which is a historic company. And that was a huge responsibility when they asked me to design a piece for their 100th anniversary, because they could have asked anybody on the planet in a way, you know. So these are some of the concerns which are very much linked of making an object, creating a form, inventing a form, making it work. At the same time, hopefully that becomes a part of collective memory. I mean, that's a big thing to say, because we as a creator, when we do something, we can never know that. We could never know that. And any classic that is created on so far in design, and you talk to the person who created, they would never know that, because you can never know these things actually. One could always try, but nobody knows it. The only time will tell us if it will last or not last, you know. But I think to try and create that attempt is a very primary thing actually, you know. So this is one important thing. Now within this talk about something that should last, there is another conversation, which is a very new conversation, and I've been part of that, and I will be presenting one lecture on that in California towards the end of this year, on atmosphere of an object. Because object, when you place object in a space, it becomes architecture sort of. It becomes the atmosphere. It has certain kind of it radiates certain atmosphere in some sense, you know. It is a collective meaning of it. So semantics is just the direct meaning of an object or a purpose of object. Atmosphere is everything, because that influences the entire context. You put a flower vase in a context of a space, it suddenly it lightens up, refreshes up, you know. Now, these kind of things are still not understood, and it is still, let's say, relatively new conversation in field of design, you know. If you say, let's say 25, 30 years ago, semantics was a new conversation, now atmosphere is a new conversation. But to understand atmosphere, I think perception is a very important to understand, human perception, how we perceive things actually, but not purely in a technical manner like we understand in a, let's say, an ergonomic sense, that how I scans the object or so forth. That is a primary basic understanding, let's say, very basic steps. But how the perception understand, I think that is another very, very important in a cognitive sense actually. And there has also been very interesting work done early on actually in India in terms of understanding the perception in a very primary way. And that perception, understanding our observation, mind as a sense, because we always consider 5 senses, and with the mind you can sense the space very quickly. How that collective work happens is very, very important thing. And there are some critical people who have done a great work on it, and among them is a senior architect from Finland, Professor Juhani Pallasmaa. He has done a beautiful work on it. He wrote many books on sensorial design, understanding atmosphere in architecture and design context. And he talks in a very, very experiential way. He doesn't talk in a kind of rhetorical, theoretical way, because as a practicing architect, he always talks very much about in a sense of experience, because design at the end is an experience, you know. And I'm very happy that among many other people who contributed in our monograph, in a book, he has contributed very important 2 essays. One is on the atmosphere of object, and another one is about the perception. Now, these things are very critical and important at the crossroad we are in design, to understand, to take it towards the conversation about form, into understanding and creating the desired atmosphere we want to create. That is genuinely human, at the same time it will last, you know. And for me, in a true sense, that is the, let's say, a sustainable design in a true sense, you know. So here we go. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask before I show you some images, you know. So
students, any questions on the chat? In case the students are asking me to record it, so I'm recording it, and then maybe you want to know, you know, like, you know, some of the projects, maybe Satyendra will show you right away.
Mhm.
And then because some of them may not have seen you, because you've got a lot of bigger audience, Satyendra, so some of them have not seen the glass table or the book which you're referring to. Maybe we'll show
Yeah.
that. I can share the screen and show them the, those the
I can share here very quickly, and
yeah, yeah, sure.
yeah.
I've given you rights to share. Yeah, please. The glass table and the book you talked about is wonderful. That's how we got into conversation, right? I was congratulating you on the book, and then this lecture came up.
Yes, yeah. So full screen. Do you see it actually?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Do you see without any lag? It works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the basic understanding that everything connects, everything influences each other. In that sense, the non-dual nature of life that we need to understand. And I think there has been a confusion, created confusion, whatever debates they're happening. I think we need to, very important thing, what has to happen in this whole conversation is to go back to the source, go back to try to understand something, but not one perspective, from many different perspectives, from different point of views. And in that sense of reality, the conversations which are created around the world often are very binary and very simplistic actually so far. And as we, let's say today, stand in sense of, let's say, understanding the world and understanding the global issues and politics and the way the world works, and nobody can say today I don't understand, because it's in your pocket, literally, with all the information you have on a smartphone. So the binary, limited, misleading ideas which are created and which people somehow continue to use, east and west and tradition and modern, in a very simplistic manner. We need much more deeper conversation on that. And these kind of a global or local, all these kind of thing, in my view, actually the design at its own core is very much an act of unity. It's a synthesis of many, many, many things, actually. Within that, it could have a specific expression and it could make sense within that context. And one object that comes to my mind is the Kokoman bottle designed by Kenji Ekoan, from Japan. Is to pour the soya sauce on your food, actually. And it's a very culture specific action, but that has really become a universal. That's the only industrial design I can think of which has really very deep cultural roots, but at the same time extremely universal, actually. But in literature, you find it all the time, actually. You take Toni Morrison from America, she specifically write about her context, but it appealed to all the world. And finally, she won the Nobel Prize of Literature. And you find many other ones, examples like that. So examples of understanding something in that sense of act of unity is a very critical question within a context of design, actually. So here is the BM objects I mentioned. Having done a lot of technological work, I wanted to understand, and I must say here, the early education, and I want to make connection with Professor Ejira at that time, is like how much like effort he put in understanding form and a passion in terms of understand the continuity of form. And I think those early lessons were very helpful to build on, to develop those things further, in a sense of making these steps. So these are the photos taken in a Bastar region, and that is the Madhya Pradesh, the Chhattisgarh region, which is hardly, now it's very difficult to access because there's a paramilitary there, one can't go. But these are the early things, and I understood that process and developed that process in a sense that you take a clay mold, like you see it on your left, then you make a clay model that's very ancient. You make a spaghetti out of the wax. You put the spaghetti on the surface, and then you heat. And that's, let's say, the wax gets burnt. You get the object in your hand. That is the bronze object, the bell metal. That's the lost wax casting process. It's exactly opposite of the mass manufacturing in some sense. And they had amazing, beautiful poetry about it that connects with the object making with life, because life also has the same uncertainties. And that was quite interesting to see. So you cover that one, and I somehow by pushing them to make certain thing, push them to make it some certain things in a much more, let's say, a refined way, because they make, in a some sense, objects. They don't make objects of utility, of course. They make objects of their symbolic use, and from that, these kind of everyday objects came, actually. So this created a kind of a language, which was a different, distinct way of making an object, Again, here is like really a do exercise to ask that primary question: what is object making in a very ancient sense? I mean, this kind of object could have made also thousands of years, but they didn't use the hanger the way we use today, actually, So those kind of questions. And then this whole process gone through our last 15 years or more, through first, second, and third generation. And this is the third generation object. And that's in many collections as well. And this is not done with the traditional process. Now, here, this object has an amazing continuity. This thread does not stop. Now, if you understand today's 3D computing and the things we have with the scanning, with the 3D modeling and all of those things, if you have to model this object, it's a nightmare. It will not be possible to get that continuity. You can remodel it, but if you don't have anything in your hand, to model it is almost difficult to get that continuity, almost impossible, unless you spend iterative like months and months and months, So I call this object in ironic sense a post-computer, post-3D CAD objects in a sense, because what discovery I made, if you go back to these objects, they are symmetrical, there's a center point, and the spaghetti goes from a center outwards, and it has this symmetry. As against here, the form is not symmetrical, and the beginning of the spaghetti is also not at the center. That leads to this amazing discovery of creating an opening, which has its own, let's say, character, own kind of a language. And there are many objects with this, like this is another one. And I especially showing this because it makes sense in this conversation of making and inventing a form in a way. It is not just, and these are simple, let's say, in terms of, they are quite elaborate exercises, but in a sense of object, these are the everyday objects, they become a cultural totems. But there is in that sense a kind of a sensoriality, that is what I was exploring in all of this actually, And there are many more like that. I'm showing few here, and from that went to this exercise of making a horse chair, which was a nightmare, which took 7 years to make actually, because to cast it in one piece. And that was extremely hard to do it because how the metal flows. So there's a lots of metallurgical knowledge. There's a lots of casting knowledge, but the primary thing that nobody wanted to take the risk actually to make it. It's such a big thing because it's a huge expensive exercise. And at that point, we created a different method, a process that using the industrial cord. And again, we have to experiment with the manufacturing industry to create the cable which has a right kind of a flexibility, model it, and from that make a silicon mold and then cast it, And that itself again was a huge exercise, but it succeeded, and it became now a really important piece in a design sense, in a design historic sense. Actually, it's in many collections, and in this piece actually, which create this polarity when it was first shown in Milan, actually, that it has a kind of a language, and this language can only be understood, and I could comprehend in only after understanding what Philip Rawson described, the method of Indian sculpting as a poetic analogy. It's not a representation. At this point, I want to bring in another interesting thing, which is often discussed and often questioned, is that the abstraction of a form, whether the abstraction is important or not. Now, abstraction and poetic analogy are two different. Abstraction of a sun will be just drawing a circle, Poetic analogy of a thing could be just painting the whole thing yellow, and could also be sun, So this is a very interesting difference, is the difference what I would say I was explaining before, how the Greek method of sculpting is created, and how the ancient Indian way of sculpting is there actually, So these are very different, distinct ways of thinking actually. But here is another interesting thing, those who want to know, and I get to see a beautiful exhibition, a big exhibition of this in Zurich many years ago. The Greek way of sculpting and the Indian way of sculpting met in history at one point of time. And that is called the Gandhara sculpting, school of sculpting. And Gandhara school is now in today's Pakistan, coming to all the way, starting from Afghanistan, coming all the way to, let's say, today's Punjab, actually, like say the Chandigarh, So in this region, the Greeks came, and the history, when the Alexander the Great came and he lost, and some of the Greek kings settled, but that was a meeting of two minds. And if you understand the Gandhara way of sculpting, you really understand the mathematical, let's say the perspective way how the Greeks did, and how the Indian poetic analogy kind of, let's say, meets and creates another language, So these are the things one need to explore and understand much more, taking away all the nonsensical discussion around it, which is a rhetorical, either colonial or religious, or some kind of trying to prove this is better than other, but trying to understand the object as it is, the sculpture as it is, without any of these peripherals, and going back to the source of it, how it was created and why it was created, what kind of expression it led to. And I think these kind of things, once understand, your maturity, understanding the depth of knowledge is so profound that you understand the form in a very different way, actually. Yeah. From there, this became an industrial piece of fish chair. Again, it's a poetic analogy. It's not a representation of a fish. That's the mold. That's the scanning. This was then. At the time it was made, the 3D softwares were not that advanced, and even if they are there today's advancement, and we use many of them, the kind of continuity of a form at the backside, which you see on the top part, which is being scanned here, is extremely difficult to model. You can, when you show it to somebody, they say, I can model it. They're always saying, I can remodel it, because when you have nothing in hand, how do you create that, And from there, you see checking the mold. And that's the huge industrial investment, manufacturing, and that's in this image, you see the prototype, you see the first batch production, and you see the blue one as an industrial production, And this is again recognized as by the critics and all that is the important, let's say, representation in the third millennia we are in, actually, in terms of creating that new language, creating that is yet industrial at the same time, let's say, fulfills all the other kind of ideas I was looking for to express, actually, Then it was presented with a special edition created in Miami some years ago, with and now is still these things are donated to them, and they are part of their big botanical garden, one of the biggest botanical garden on the planet. It's the tropical garden is called Fairchild Tropical Garden. If you ever get to go to Miami, you see that. So it's a part of their landscape now. Then talking about, again, creating form, I'm choosing examples which will give you a thought process. That does not mean the entire work is about this. These are some examples of it. That every culture we give flower. Flower is a kind of celebration in the human history. So creating an object which has that kind of a language, it had a tremendous technical issues, actually, to make a ceramic object of this size. This is in a workshop north of Venice. This is the mold, you see that, and these are the glazes which are made, actually, platinum, then this is the Bosco green and so forth, And that's also a very important piece, actually, made in some small series, but it's more let's say, and it is strong enough to sit. So you can sit, but it's not the object to sit in front of your computer for 8 hours, But it is again that kind of analogy going further, Then there is another thing, a roll carbon ceramic chair, which was again a provocation. This was an early prototype made at the wonderful European Ceramic Work Center here, again exploring the form, trying to understand. This is a hand-built form, hand-thrown by people who can throw the ceramic at that scale. And then I wanted to bring the question, because there's a lot of nonsensical conversation about high-tech and low-tech, And that conversation doesn't make sense. I mean, you need a phone, you need an iPhone, you need a phone, yeah? But when you need a hammer, your phone is useless. In life, you need both, So this conversation sometimes is a kind of again, that binary east-west, this technological, non-technological. I think we need everything. And within that context, you don't need to create hierarchies or separations, So as a provocation, what I did is when you talk about a carbon fiber, everybody thinks about racing car, something technological, but in fact, carbon fiber is a messy material, not ecological, is a trouble to work with. But of course, it has certain properties. It's light and it's strong and so forth. But on the other hand, ceramic is exactly opposite. It can last for, I don't know, centuries if there is no, let's say, any destruction of it. And on the other hand, I wanted to create this kind of a tension of something which is perceived as a technological and something not considered as technological. In fact, ceramic is extremely technological because it's to control ceramic is a million times difficult than to control a metal or a plastic of any form. And synthesize them as a provocation. And only one piece was made, and this is now part of the one important collection in Hong Kong, where there will be most important exhibition museum, which should be opening soon, about design on the planet seen from a global perspective or seen mainly from Asian perspective as well. So you see the details of it, how articulate it is made.
Lovely, very nice.
Yeah, and then I go further to another piece, which was 100-year celebration of a company called Poltrona Frau, which is almost a national pride of Italy. And this was a piece made for a gentleman's club 100 years ago when people used to smoke cigar. You had clubs, so this was one of still it's in production. Some people still have it as a continuation of tradition. And when I was invited to design something to celebrate 100 years, my question was, how can one bring, what is the kind of that continuity that we have today? So we live in a connected world today, and we use all kind of technology, you have certain things. So how can one create a personal space to do all kind of things? And this is, to understand this a very, let's say, 100-year-old piece, and what could be our piece, how can one create the personal space? And from that came this project actually, and it has every single detail is articulately made, and many prototypes, and finally this piece is made. And you see here, it has a footrest, it has a lap tray, so you can use your mobile device, you can use your computer, and it had just the basic ergonomics. There's no technology there. So the potential of this project, the aspiration in this project was, can it last for that long, another century? That is just a huge challenge, but one can try at least, and it's in production. They still make it. So this was launched on the 100th anniversary. So it has a laptop. So you create your own personal space within a context of it. Today, as we know, smoking is not cool anymore. It's considered extremely uncool and unhealthy. So, so here is the context in which we work, and this could be, you could use with the devices, or you can just create your personal context actually, So that's also the language, the kind of continuity one could bring, but at the same time create a contemporary object that belongs to our time and hopefully sustain for a longer time, Then this is another project, which is again very important, technological yet industrial, very industrial. And this is a door handle. Now, a door handle is a first handshake with a building. And I always been very curious about architecture, and my growth and going into architecture has been organic in that sense, because you make object that creates the space, that creates atmosphere, that leads into the context in which you live, and that becomes architecture. And the architecture really happened as I was invited to contribute to certain projects on different kind of capacity as a designer, being on the jury, and so on and so forth. And that led to different kind of projects. One of them is here, was conceived for Rotterdam, creating a design center some years ago, and so on and so forth. So these kind of projects, they have a lot more complexity, and the notion of something ought to last, because architecture lasts for centuries and built in that kind of a sense as well. So that this whole conversation and thinking about what will make sense for years to come becomes very important. At the same time, it has very many different challenges. The scale is different, all of those kind of things. And I'm very happy and glad that the one leading to another project started evolving, and one could get and create and make a larger works actually in that kind of context. So within that, this is a project which is equally important, because I don't consider if it's a door handle it's less important, if it's a building it's more important, or it's a vase is less, or it's a complex, let's say, a dynamic table is more important. I think each project has equal importance, and within a studio practice, each project gets equal dedicated effort and a time actually in that sense, you know. So this was one of the early idea because of the ergonomics, how you hold the door handle. And door handle is probably the product you, unless you are really designing, you're creating something, you never really look at. We hardly look at door handle, we just use it. So it's a very sensorial object, you know. And then it gone through a lot of prototyping and making and so forth. And finally, after making those things, this is the production piece, you know. So it's a very articulately made object, and at the same time clean. It has that sensoriality that it just has to fit right in your hand, you know. So that's what it's all about. And it is mass manufactured to an extent that on the manufacturing, there's no human being. It's all automated in a sense, you know, all the way to packaging, you know. And this is where comes a very important project, which was quite a challenge, because this is a company who almost invented a way of making object in a new way, that is a glass. Now you don't associate glass with a structural object like a table. Table is really a structural object. You do it, you bang on it, you work on it, you can stand on it, you can, you really use as an architectural element in a house, you know, like you can, it's not something like a delicate thing. Table is something you work on actually, you know. So table is something to make us that structural object in a material which is considered traditionally so fragile, is something very, very important step which happened in history. And this is a company who made it happen. And if you use a certain glass in a certain way, it is tempered, it is as strong as a metal actually. It's very, very strong, you know. So this is a very high-tech industry in a sense that it is very artisanal, but yet very high-tech, means it has all these furnaces to heat the glass and so forth. And glass is a kind of contemporary technological material that you project a sort of future on it. You see, hey, something glass means it, because it is a technological material, you know. At the same time, it's a natural material. So you see how because you can't manipulate the glass or bend the glass or control the glass by hand. So it all done with the fixtures. You can't open the furnace bigger because the heat will go out, you know. So it's a quite challenging process how you do it. You know, it's almost like working in aerospace industry in a way, you know. And how the glass is bent, and how it is tempered, and how it is brought to the kind of quality one brings. And as I was working on this project, I came across this beautiful, let's say, description of a table by Hannah Arendt, and she's a political philosopher. And she talks how glass, the table as an object is such a humble object that it brings together. It has a spirit of bringing together, and still yet remains sort of invisible. Because when you have a meeting, you meet people, you gather the family, you meet your friends, you really never talk about the table is like a humble object that's supporting you, you know. And that kind of invisible table in a literal sense I wanted to create, you know. So it's been really a fantastic journey. It was one of the technically challenging projects to do something. The conventional mechanisms and all, I managed to put the whole table upside down and create a very compact mechanism, which gone through its own, because such project has to go through the test, understand, that has to be made properly. And that's what the table creates, a social space, you know. So that's one of the early idea sketch. That's the mechanism, how the mechanism works actually, the way, and it worked just with one knob actually, you know. And that's the mechanism seen from the backside. Every detail on this project has been controlled, like we always do on any project. And this is the mechanism in work. But the project is not just the mechanism, the entire process to make that leg in that elegant way itself was another process, you know. That's complete. And that's the table. From 2 meters, it becomes 3 meters. So it's quite a big span of table actually. And when it's in a space, it's almost like your space is empty sort of. It doesn't block the space, you know. And you can control, you can have a 2 meter long and it can be 3 meter long, like here you see. So, and making this leg was, again, it has a certain inclination. To get that right as well was a lot of control in terms of manufacturing, Here is another project which really takes the typology and sees it in a complete different lights. This is about Radiator. Now, in a big part of the world, Radiator is not used, but the Radiator is used where there is it's colder places, like in Europe, yeah. And Radiator over a period of time somehow remains same. It's maybe 120 years ago it was made in the form it is used. It is always put on the wall and it's always in a corner. Often it's a kind of a technical project which nobody looks at, and it's always kind of considered as a hardware. It's even hidden. Sometimes even in some of the houses you see, they make a wooden closet around it. Now, if you understand that, Radiator is primarily to heat the space because it's so cold and you want to make a warm, cozy environment within a living space, actually. So if you put a radiator on the wall, it first heats the wall. So all the energy goes in the wall and then it heats the space, actually. And if you put in a closet, the amount, the time and energy it takes to heat the space even takes longer. So when I was invited to design a radiator, my first thought was the radiator should be where you really need it. That means it should be in the middle of a space where you need to warm your space, basically, to feel cozy and comfortable. Now, to think that as an idea seems like a simple thing, but it was a tremendous work to create a radiator that is specifically can go become a part of architecture. And what I mean a tremendous work in terms of collaborative work in translating that idea into making a manufacturable product, So that's the end result I'm showing here, but it's gone through many, many thoughts. So it's a radiator, is a very technological project. How the hydraulic radiator to make it work is even more complex than electric, because electric is just the cable that heats up. Hydraulic is the one where the water passes through it. And how can you get the moment the hot water passes through, there's certain pressure, there's certain, let's say, safety requirements and all those kind of things. And it's gone through many, 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 many conversations, meeting, prototypes, and this is a very close collaboration with the manufacturing industry. Many, many prototypes, a lot of testing, and a lot of, let's say, assembly techniques, because when you create a product like this, you have to even think the industry together with the designer thinks even a new way of manufacturing, and as set up a new assembly line, a manufacturing line for that, and so forth. So, and that's the final result, So the radiator can be put on the wall, but it is mainly designed to create a space. So that kind of creates a kind of, it heats the space. And what we found is we save up to 40% of energy. That's a tremendous amount of, let's say, energy that gets lost otherwise if you just put it on the wall and it heats up the wall first, But at the end, what I could say, the object eventually, all these kind of objects, or your computer or your system, whatever they are there, they become part of your life. You don't really think about them, and we should not be thinking about them because you have to do other things. So the question here is, the radiator becomes a part of our atmosphere, ambience. So as I was talking earlier, in terms of how the form object becomes a part of the atmosphere. Here is the actual real example of that, where the radiator becomes a part of architecture, becomes a part of atmosphere that it seamlessly, it almost like creates that kind of a notion. Now the thing is, this project requires, this is a synthesis of actually a project where the understanding of how the radiator works and how you would like the new radiator to make it work, at the same time how it would be manufactured and should be manufactured, that complies all manufacturing and technical and production requirement. At the same time, it becomes an industrially viable product that can be used in any country around the world, because if you go to Japan, there's a different manufacturing. Then you go to Canada, there's a different way of assembling the putting things in an architectural context. So we have to solve all of those issues. So there's a lot of those issues need to be resolved. At the same time, the end user is not concerned about that. The person is going to get that atmospheric, aesthetic, let's say, experience out of it, besides making the space cozy and warm and comfortable. So this is a product of industrial design, I could say, where you have all these parameters which have been taken care and synthesized into an industrial product. Now this kind of thing is one could say an innovation in a sense of typology, because it's a different type of radiator. Traditionally, such radiators never existed. It is a different way of manufacturing a radiator, because traditionally such radiators are not manufactured and assembled and tested in this manner. So one had to do series of innovations and inventions at the same time, which are synthesis of many ways of many disciplines and ways, with a pure design guiding the course of the product development eventually to become.
For example, one of the biggest challenge would be to prevent it from leaking, because you have multiple units joining together.
Exactly.
So how you join them, 100% always correct, would be a very key thing for the.
That's really, that's one of the obvious things you said, is that's because the leaking, and if you get one kind of a leak like that, or if there's a domestic accident, the company will be history, it will be gone, it will be sued.
So even if it bends and you bang against it, it's not supposed to leak. It has to be so good. Yeah,
it has to be so. Exactly. So all these things are really very critical, and these are the really the primary things in a design, where eventually it's not about that. Eventually it's the aesthetic. This image represent is the experience actually, of the object.